Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into a disease that, well, currently impacts something like 50 million people worldwide. Alzheimer's disease, or AD. It's actually the most common form of dementia, accounting for maybe 60 to 70% of all cases. It's just a profound challenge for science, for healthcare, families, globally.
And that challenge is really compounded by the timeline, isn't it? I mean, AD was first described way back in 1906 by Aldous Alzheimer.
Over a century ago.
Right. But it's still this progressive neurodegenerative condition, usually starts after 65. And once you get that diagnosis, the average life expectancy, well, it can be brutally short, sometimes just 3 years, maybe up to 12.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We're going to try and distill the core knowledge on AD for you today. Our mission is sort of threefold. First, we really need to understand how this disease progresses, through its different stages.
Which can be devastating.
Absolutely. Second, we need to drill down into the science, the competing theories, the overlapping ideas behind the damage happening in the brain cells.
The plaques and tangles story.
Exactly. And finally, we want to look at the very latest stuff, what research is offering in terms of diagnosis and management. Now, when we look at how it progresses, the first thing that really struck us in the source material is how subtle it is at the start.
Oh, definitely.
The disease is active, doing damage long before anyone really recognizes it, often just mistaken for, normal forgetting as you get older, or maybe stress.
Absolutely. The pathology, the damage, it often begins right in the brain's memory center, the hippocampus. That's why the most noticeable early sign is usually short-term memory loss.
Right.
Difficulty remembering, say, a recent conversation or learning something new. This period, we often call it mild cognitive impairment, or MCI.
Okay, MCI. But what makes that different from just, having a senior moment? What defines it as something more serious?
Well, the key thing for you, the listener, to grasp is that MCI isn't just the occasional memory slip. It tends to involve subtle issues with higher-level brain functions, too.
Like what?
Specifically, executive functions. Things like planning ahead, abstract thinking, and crucially, apathy is really common.
Apathy. Like lack of interest.
Yeah, a loss of motivation. It often emerges as the most persistent symptom right through the disease. Depression can also appear alongside it. Now, if memory loss is the main symptom in MCI, we call that amnestic MCI.
Amnestic, okay.
And the sources show that type has a greater than 90% chance of being linked to underlying Alzheimer's pathology. That kind of percentage makes it a really critical early warning sign.
So, as those memory and learning problems get worse, that's when we move into the early stage, where a proper clinical diagnosis usually happens.
That's generally when, yes. And it's interesting, like you said, how AD targets memory selectively, at least initially.
It attacks new memories first, right?
It does. It preferentially hits your ability to acquire new information. Older memories, things like memories from your childhood episodic memory or skills you've learned, like knowing how to use a fork procedural memory. Those tend to be affected much less, especially early on. But as the disease progresses in this early stage, language issues start creeping in too. Vocabulary might shrink a bit. Finding the right word becomes harder. What we call decreased...
It's one thing to talk about these stages clinically, but thinking about the human impact, that failure to recognize loved ones, the loss of daily abilities, that's where the real devastation hits home. Especially when behavioral symptoms start.
Precisely. Behavioral and neuropsychiatric changes become very common here. Things like wandering, getting lost easily, irritability, sudden mood swings, emotional lability, and maybe the most well-known is sundowning.
Right, sundowning. That increased confusion and agitation later in the day.
Exactly, often in the late afternoon or evening. These behavioral changes are often the tipping point, really, that necessitates professional round-the-clock care.
And then finally, there's the late stage, basically complete dependence.
Yes. Mobility deteriorates hugely. Muscle mass is lost. The person often becomes bedridden, unable to feed themselves. Language can be reduced to just single words, or sometimes lost entirely.
So what's the eventual cause of death? Is it the Alzheimer's itself?
Well, while the disease process itself is ultimately fatal, the direct cause of death is usually an external factor. Things like infections from pressure sores, or perhaps aspiration pneumonia from inhaling food or liquid. The sources also mention something really quite mysterious and rare. Paradoxical lucidity.
Paradoxical lucidity.
Yeah, it's this brief, unexpected return of mental clarity, sometimes speech, right before death. We don't really understand why it happens.
Wow. That's
That's it.
quite something. What a staggering progression. And to understand why it's so destructive, especially from that middle stage onwards. We really need to get into the weeds of what's happening at the cellular level.
Right.
You mentioned earlier, it's fundamentally a proteopathy, a disease caused by misfolded proteins.
Correct. That's the core biological definition. AD is characterized by two main types of these misfolded protein clumps or aggregates. You've got the amyloid plaques.
Right.
These are dense, sticky deposits of a peptide called amyloid beta. And these plaques build up outside the neurons in the spaces between the brain cells.
Outside. Got it. And the second type?
Those are the neurofibrillary tangles. These are different. They're made of a protein called tau, which normally helps stabilize the neuron's internal structure. But in AD, tau gets abnormally modified, hyperphosphorylated, and forms these sticky tangles inside the neuron.
Inside. So plaques outside, tangles inside.
Exactly. And those tangles basically mess up the cell's transport system and eventually lead to cell death.
And the presence of these two distinct things, plaques and tangles, has fueled this big debate for decades, hasn't it? About which one really starts the fire.
It absolutely has. The first major theory and the longest-standing one is the amyloid hypothesis.
Which says?
It basically argues that the buildup of that A peptide forming the plaques outside the cells is the fundamental trigger. Everything else, including the tau tangles inside the cells, is seen as downstream consequence of that initial amyloid problem.
Now, our sources really emphasize the link to Down syndrome here. Can you explain why that's such compelling evidence for the amyloid hypothesis?
It's incredibly powerful evidence, actually. People with Down syndrome have trisomy 21, meaning they have 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of the usual 2.
Right.
And the gene that codes for the protein that ACT comes from the amyloid precursor protein, or ATP. That gene sits right on chromosome 21.
Ah, so they have an extra copy of the APP gene.
Exactly. Which means they produce more APP and consequently more apeptide throughout their lives. And what we see is that individuals with Down syndrome almost universally develop the plaques and tangles characteristic of AD by the time they're 40.
Wow, universally by 40. That strongly suggests just having more AC is enough to kickstart the whole process.
It's a very strong correlation, yes. Also, the rare inherited forms of early onset Alzheimer's are all caused by mutations in either the APP gene itself or in the enzymes that cut APP up to produce AC. Again, pointing to AP as the initiator.
But then there's the competing tau hypothesis.
Right. This theory proposes that it's actually the abnormalities in the tau protein leading to the tangles inside the neurons that really initiates the disease cascade.
And the evidence for that?
It comes partly from brain pathology studies. You can sometimes detect tau tangles starting to form in certain vulnerable brain areas before significant A-plaque deposits are visible.
Before the plaques?
In some regions, yes. However, it's complicated because abnormal tauopathy, occurs in many other neurodegenerative diseases too, not just Alzheimer's. So its role as the sole primary trigger in AD is debated.
So if tau sometimes appears first, why does the scientific consensus still seem to lean towards amyloid API being the initiator, at least in most cases?
Well, I think the consensus now is that the hypotheses aren't really mutually exclusive. They're likely interconnected.
Okay.
The prevailing view, sort of, is that the abnormal API accumulation might be the spark that lights the fire. It initiates the disease process, maybe triggers inflammation and synaptic problems. But you need the subsequent spread of tau pathology, the tangles, for the widespread neuronal death and the full devastating clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's to really take hold. One might start it, but the other is needed for the full disaster.
So ECOT starts it, tau drives the neurodegeneration. That makes sense. Now, speaking of initiation, for most people who get Alzheimer's, it's the late onset sporadic form, not those rare genetic types. We absolutely have to talk about the single biggest genetic risk factor known for that.
Ah, yes, the APOE4 allele.
APOE epsilon 4. What is APOE?
Apolipoprotein E. It's a protein mainly involved in transporting fats, lipids in the bloodstream and also in the brain. And importantly, it plays a role in clearing apeptide out of the brain.
Okay, so it's involved in cleanup.
Exactly. Now, there are different versions or alleles of the APOE gene. Most common is AP3, but some people inherit the APO4 version, the APOE4 allele. And carrying just one copy of AP4 roughly triples your risk of developing late-onset AD.
Triples. Wow.
And if you inherit 2 copies, one from each parent, your risk goes up by about 15 times.
15 times. That's huge. Why is APO so bad?
Well, it seems the APOE4 protein is simply less efficient at binding to and clearing away AWA compared to the other versions like APO3. So ABA might hang around longer and build up more easily in people with A4.
But it's not deterministic, right? Having APOE4 doesn't guarantee you'll get AD.
No, absolutely not. It's what we call incomplete penetrance. It significantly increases risk, but doesn't determine destiny. Other genetic factors, environmental factors, lifestyle, they all play a role in whether someone with APOE4 actually develops the disease. It's complex. Interestingly, this risk association isn't even universal across all populations. For example, studies in Nigerian Yoruba people haven't shown the same strong link between APOE4 and AD risk,
Fascinating.
which just highlights how many factors are involved.
Right. And if we connect that to the bigger picture, beyond the core genetics like APOE and these defining proteins, A to B, A, and tau, what else is influencing who gets AD? It seems like the disease is clearly influenced by a whole host of things.
Oh, absolutely. It's really complex, which raises that important question. What else is at play here?
And that brings us to this whole list of other potential risk factors, doesn't it? Many seem linked to lifestyle or overall systemic health.
That's right. We know, for instance, that having clinical depression or chronic high blood pressure, particularly in midlife, or prolonged psychological stress, these are all established risk factors for later dementia, including AD.
Okay. And what about this idea about infections or inflammation? That seems to be getting more attention lately.
Yes, the infection-inflammation hypothesis. This is gaining traction. The idea is that certain infections, maybe some human herpes viruses, like the ones causing cold sores or chickenpox, or perhaps even a severe case of COVID-19 in older adults, might act as triggers.
Triggers how?
Well, one quite intriguing idea is that the AS peptide itself might actually be part of the brain's innate immune response.
You mean it's trying to fight infection?
Potentially, yes. The theory goes that brain cells might generate ASA as an antimicrobial peptide to trap or neutralize pathogens. But if this process becomes chronic or dysregulated, it could lead to the harmful buildup of plaques and the persistent neuroinflammation that we see as a hallmark of AD.
So the brain's defense mechanism might backfire, essentially.
That's one line of thinking, yeah. And it ties into the broader theme of chronic neuroinflammation being a key feature of the disease.
And then there's sleep. That seems critical too, and it works both ways.
Yes, it's a really key bidirectional relationship. We know poor sleep, particularly disruption of deep sleep, is common in Alzheimer's patients, but there's growing evidence that poor sleep earlier in life might also be a risk factor for developing AD.
Why would that be?
Well, think about brain cleanup again. The brain has the sort of waste clearance system, the glymphatic system, that's much more active during deep sleep. It flushes out metabolic byproducts, including a peptide.
Ah, so less deep sleep means less efficient A clearance?
Exactly. So getting adequate sleep, generally recommended around 7 to 8 hours for adults, might actually be a protective preventative factor by helping clear out that potentially harmful ACO before it builds up.
Okay, that's a tangible lifestyle factor. Now, moving towards diagnosis. Despite all this understanding, the fact remains that a truly definite AD diagnosis still requires looking at brain tissue after death.
Historically, yes. A definitive diagnosis needed that post-mortem examination to actually see the plaques and tangles under a microscope. Clinical diagnoses made while the person is alive have always been termed possible or probable AD.
So how are those clinical diagnoses made currently?
They rely heavily on a combination of things: a detailed medical history from the patient and family members, neurological exams, and standardized cognitive testing. You mentioned MMSE earlier, the mini mental state examination, and the MoCA, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment.
Wait, those tests?
Yeah, they help quantify the level of cognitive impairment, track decline over time, and importantly, help rule out other possible causes for the symptoms like strokes, tumors, vitamin deficiencies, or thyroid problems.
But the real game changer everyone's hoping for is earlier, more definitive detection while someone's still alive, ideally using less invasive methods.
Exactly, because if we want future treatments to work, especially those targeting the early stages, we need to diagnose much earlier and more accurately. And there has been a major development there recently.
The blood test.
Yes. In May 2025, the U.S. FDA approved a specific blood test. It's called the Lumipulse G p-tau 217's amyloid 142 plasma ratio test. Bit of a mouthful.
Ah, yeah. What does it do?
It measures the ratio of a specific form of phosphorylated tau, p-tau 217 to L42 in the blood plasma. This ratio seems to correlate well with the presence of amyloid plaques in the brain. It's approved for adults aged 55 and older who are already showing symptoms to help determine if amyloid pathology is likely present.
So it's not quite a screening test for everyone yet, but it's a big step towards using biomarkers in the blood for earlier detection in symptomatic people.
It's a very significant step forward, moving us closer to diagnosing the core pathology much earlier than before.
Okay, so diagnosis is improving. But given we still don't have a cure that can stop or reverse the disease, prevention through managing those modifiable risk factors seems like the main area of hope right now.
It absolutely is. Prevention research is really focusing on areas where we can potentially intervene. 3 key things stand out from the sources. First, physical activity.
Exercise.
Yes. There's strong evidence associating regular physical activity with a lower rate of dementia. The sources mention studies suggesting things like brisk walking, maybe 3 times a week for 40 minutes or so, can be highly protective. Good for the heart, good for the brain.
Makes sense. What's the second area?
Cognitive reserve. This is a really interesting concept.
Cognitive reserve.
Yeah,
Like building up brain resilience.
sort of, yeah. The idea is that people with higher levels of education or those who had mentally demanding jobs or who actively engage in mentally stimulating activities throughout life, things like reading widely, learning languages, playing chess, doing puzzles.
Keeping the brain active.
Exactly. They seem to be able to tolerate more Alzheimer's pathology in their brain before they start showing clinical symptoms. It doesn't prevent the plaques and tangles from forming necessarily, but it delays the onset of dementia symptoms. It buys them time, essentially.
So building up that reserve helps compensate for the damage longer. And the third area, diet.
Yes, diet. Several dietary patterns have been linked to better cognitive health and slower decline. The Mediterranean diet is one.
Lots of fruits, vegetables, fish, olive oil.
Right. Also the DASH diet, which is designed to stop hypertension, and a combination called the MIND diet, which specifically pulls elements from both Mediterranean and DASH that seem most beneficial for brain health. They all emphasize plant-based foods, healthy fats, limiting red meat and sweets. Again, reinforcing that idea that what's good for your cardiovascular system tends to be good for your brain.
Okay, so lifestyle matters. But for people who already have the disease, what about management? You mentioned current drugs offer only small, temporary benefits.
That's right. The older drugs, like acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, donepezil, rivastigmine, galantamine, and memantine, they mainly treat the symptoms. They can provide modest temporary improvements in memory or thinking for some people, but they don't slow down the underlying disease progression at all.
But now there are these new drugs, the antibodies. That feels like a different category altogether.
It really is a potential paradigm shift. We're talking about lecanemab and donanemab. These are monoclonal antibodies specifically designed to target and remove those aggregates, the plaques, from the brain.
So they're actually targeting the presumed root cause, the amyloid?
Correct. They are the first approved treatments considered disease-modifying for Alzheimer's. Clinical trials have shown that they do result in a statistically significant slowing of cognitive and functional decline in people with early-stage AD or MCI due to AD.
Slowing, not stopping or reversing.
Critically, yes, slowing.
Yeah.
It's a major step scientifically to show we can modify the disease course by targeting amyloid, but it's not a cure.
And these treatments, they're not without issues, are they?
No, definitely not. There are significant caveats. First, they are very expensive. Second, there are ongoing questions about how much that statistically significant slowing actually translates into meaningful, real-world benefit for patients and families.
Okay.
And third, there are definite safety concerns. The main one is something called ARIA. It stands for amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. This refers to side effects visible on brain MRI scans, typically either temporary brain swelling, ARIA, or microbleeds, ARIAH. While often asymptomatic, ARIA can sometimes cause symptoms like headache, confusion, dizziness, and in rare cases can be serious.
So patients need regular MRI monitoring.
Yes, requires careful patient selection and regular monitoring. So while these drugs represent real hope and progress in targeting the biology, their place in treatment is still being figured out, balancing the potential benefits against the costs and risks.
It paints a complex picture. Progress, but challenges remain.
Absolutely. And if we just, connect this back to the bigger picture, Alzheimer's disease is just a monumental societal challenge. The estimated global annual cost is astronomical, around US $1 trillion.
$1 trillion.
Globally, yes. And think about the human cost, the burden on caregivers. Just in the U.S., it's estimated that informal caregivers, usually family members, provide something like 18.5 billion hours of unpaid care each year.
Billion with a B.
Billion. It's an immense strain on families, emotionally, physically, financially. It really underscores why finding more effective treatments and ultimately a cure is such an urgent global priority.
And I think the key lesson pulling together the science we've discussed today, is just how long this disease process is active before we even see the major symptoms.
That's crucial.
Those destructive mechanisms, the amyloid buildup, the tau tangles they're likely simmering away in the brain for maybe 10, 15, even 20 years before someone shows clear signs of dementia, which just powerfully reinforces the need for much earlier detection and ideally interventions that could start way back then, long before the widespread damage is done.
Definitely. Prevention and very early intervention have to be the goal. And despite all the incredible progress we've made in understanding the proteins like ACM and tau that cause the damage, there's still a fundamental scientific mystery that researchers are really grappling with.
What's that?
It's this question of selective vulnerability.
Selective vulnerability.
Yeah. We know these abnormal proteins, AP and tau, are widespread in the brain in AD, but why are certain brain regions like the hippocampus, the memory center, and even specific types of neurons and specific synapses within those regions hit so much harder and earlier than others? Why are some areas relatively spared, at least for a long time?
So it's not just that damage occurs, but why it occurs so specifically in certain places first.
Exactly. Why here and not there? What makes those particular cells or connections uniquely vulnerable to the toxic effects of AP and tau? Understanding that selective vulnerability, well, that might hold the key not just to slowing the disease, but maybe one day to truly stopping it from taking hold in those critical areas. It's a question that still drives a huge amount of research today.
A fascinating question to leave our listeners with. Why here and not there? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Alzheimer's disease.